Greetings. My name is Atimaneda George. I'm a Green Fellow with the American Folklife Center, the Library of Congress, and I'm delighted to welcome Amelia Fitzjohn Broderick to Playing the Angels game. Amelia, would you tell us how you first learned about the U.S. Foreign Service, when you joined, and a little bit about your career?
Well, Ateem, thank you. It's lovely to see you again. Um, I love to tell this story. It's a story of I'm minding my own business, and God entered my life. I was at graduate school at Howard University studying African studies and majoring in literature. And one day I looked up at the notice board, and there was this piece that said, the United States Foreign Service is looking for women and minorities. And I thought, wow, I'm both of those. My plan had been to be an academic. I was working toward my PhD at the time, and I thought after that, I'd been teaching before I came back into graduate school, and I thought I would just continue teaching, which I enjoyed very much. Then I thought, the Foreign Service. I don't know very much about the US Foreign Service. I know a little bit about diplomacy because my father was a diplomat, having been an academic and then invited by his country, Sierra Leone, to open the embassy here in Washington and then go and be High Commissioner in London and so on. But I hadn't thought about it as a career for myself um, because I thought I enjoyed being an educator and I would continue to do that. But I followed up on this notice, and I had a very dear friend in Washington who I shared my initial application with. And she read it and she looked at my essay and she said, "Oh my goodness, Amelia, in the first page, you've already been on 3 continents. They're going to love you." And I hadn't really thought about my life in those terms, but I thought, well, let's see where it leads. I was very fortunate because I lived in the DMV in the Washington area. So I was close to Peace Corps, United States Information Agency, and the Department of State. I was able to do research on these agencies, on all of the foreign affairs agencies. And I decided that the only ones that really interested me were Peace Corps, USAID, and USIA. Well, I had applied to all of them. Um, the only one, well, two of them really came back to me with positive responses. USAID told me that I didn't have enough technical expertise, even though I had taught for a long time. I thought I could get into their education cone. Um, but whatever technical expertise meant, I didn't know, but I didn't have it. And Peace Corps thought, yes, we'd love to have you come in as an APCD, an assistant Peace Corps director, and we'll send you to Africa. But they only allowed you to stay in government service for 7 years. USIA, on the other hand, sounded very interesting because they did a lot of things, a lot of program ideas, things that interested me. USIA was the show and tell of the US Embassy. They were telling America's story to foreign audiences. I thought this sounds fascinating. USA had the Fulbright program. USIA did professional exchanges. USIA did media connections with foreign broadcasters through the Voice of America and through the information officer specialty, where we kept in touch with foreign journalists in host countries and invited them to the US. So many different aspects of USIA. I actually visited the USIA office and I met a man named John Dixon, and I mention his name because I think he was such an important component early in my career, in that I didn't know him. I had no idea who he was, but he was very kind to me and he directed me as to what to do. And I took the exam, even though he said this special programs didn't need the exam, but I went to Wilson High School and I took the exam anyway. And I'm always glad that I did. Um, and everything was in order. He reviewed my package and he said he would send it through to decision makers. And I got a response to say they'd like me to come for an interview in January of 1980. I actually started this whole process at the end of 1978, and it took that long. And January of 1980, I was invited to an interview, and there were three white males, and I was fortunate because there was a fourth male, no women, and this fourth male was a black man who had served in Africa. So I felt that he was perhaps sort of a balancing factor in the interview committee. Anyway, I went in, I did the interview, the oral interview, I did the written assessment, I did an inbox test, all of these parts of the selection process. And at the end of the day, they said to me, "We like you. You've been selected." I almost dropped. I first of all didn't realize that the decision-making process would be so fast, that at the end of that process, they would know that um, this particular candidate was somebody that they wanted, because there were others in the group who they didn't want, and they were very forlorn. I felt gratified, grateful. Um, the next step was to get invited to be part of an orientation class. And I got that letter for June 16th, 1980. There were about 15 people in my orientation class, or 20, and I still am in touch with many of them. In fact, I saw uh, one not too long ago, just a few weeks ago, regretfully at the funeral of another dear Foreign Service colleague. But we were a good group. Um, I'm thinking now, I was the only Black woman, and there were two Black men in the group. And it was about, I think there were more women actually in that group. And that may have something to do, I learned later, about the Foreign Service trying to make up for past ills. And USIA ended up having many more women in its core than even the State Department did, trying to make up for not having done right by women professionals in the past. Anyway, we had a wonderful orientation. It's a great overview to the Foreign Service. It tells you everything that you need to know before you come in. And in my case, I was assigned to Brazil. By the end of the class, you all know where you're going. I was assigned to Brazil. But you know what? I had this most uninteresting job in Brazil. I was going to go out there and take care of videotapes. I was going to be in charge of, well, because we did a lot of programming with videos, invited guests, and they came and watched. And I was going to be in charge of that. And I thought, that doesn't sound very challenging. So we put it that way. But then on the private side of my life, this man who I'd known most of my life re-entered my life and asked me if I would marry him. We had been very good friends through graduate school, but I hadn't thought of him in romantic terms. So when he came and he started to ask me out, and then he said he'd like to marry me, and I thought, Modupe Broderick, what's all this? I'm going to Brazil. And maybe you're going to throw a little confusion in my plans. But I shared it. I had a wonderful career counselor. Her name was Kathy. And I explained it all to her. And she said, Amelia, don't worry. We will keep you in Washington. And I say this in a little bit of detail. I'll go in to tell you about my Foreign Service posts globally. But I tell you this because what has been planned for you is always the best. And when fate has it planned, just sort of follow through. And she said, because I told you I wasn't interested in this video job. And she said, you stay back in Washington and I'll assign you to ECA, the Educational and Cultural Affairs Bureau. And I'll assign you to work in the exchanges program, um, which she did. And I worked with wonderful people who were really my first mentors. One was a civil service woman, Teresa Johnson. And then there was a Foreign Service officer, Tony Kazanoff, who was the head of what is now known as voluntary visitors. And I won't go into exactly what it is. It's still bringing foreign professionals to America. But I learned a lot about exchange programs in that time that I was assigned there, really to buy time until I got married and until Brazil could find another post because it was huge. It was one of America's largest class one missions. And so I really was excited about that possibility. And it all worked out. I got married, I went to Brazil, and I was in training for about 6 months. I had a um, supervisor who was in charge. He was a deputy public affairs officer, PAO. And this gentleman, Kenton Keith, turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to a junior officer at the beginning of her career. And Kenton was a wonderful guide. And I had been assigned then to be the exchanges officer, which was perfect. And and I had all this Washington experience of dealing with exchange programs. And then my first position overseas was going to be in charge of exchanges for the whole of Brazil. Brazil, and I was assigned to Brasilia, the capital city, which was still quite new. I think people moved there in 1960s. And here I was, this is the 80s, so 20 years later. It was still a young capital. But for me, I found it very vibrant. I, after all, had spent much of my life in the capital of the United States, in the Washington area. So I knew that capitals were not necessarily these zippy zangy cities like Rio and New York, but nevertheless, they were important. And I met wonderful people in Brazil. I learned, I learned what the Foreign Service meant. And I was very fortunate because it was such a huge country. It was Brasilia plus 7 constituent posts, 7 other branches of the embassy, 7 consular offices around the country. And because of my work, I got to travel to like 6 of them in the course of the 3 years that I was there. My daughter Vanya was born in Brazil. Um, my husband taught first at the American school. He got a position there. They made him the head of the humanities department. But he came from academia. He had taught literature, African literature in Nigeria and in the United States. And I think he found teaching young people a little bit of a trial. So he found grant money and went to do research in Salvador da Bahia on their African roots up there and found that a very exciting um, experience. Brazil was everything I dreamed of for Post. We had highly qualified local staff. I learned a lot from them. They were very kind to us. And even though I had been told Brazil, as a Black woman, be very careful because Brazil has a lot of race issues. Um, I don't know, perhaps because I am an American, I found the Brazilians warm and friendly. I realized there was a lot of inequity in between classes, and not just necessarily black and white, although it was mostly there, but also just economically. If you Indian Brazilians, people of native heritage, well, also many of them were underprivileged. So it Brazil had a lot of work to do. And I have to say today that they have made a lot of progress since we were there um, 40 years ago, 45 years ago. Um, Brazil really um, trained me. And I say that because after my 3 year tour, I spent the next 6 years in Africa before I returned to Washington for sort of reorientation and reconnection um, to the home country, the homestead. And I spent the rest of my career really after Brazil in Africa. And after all, I studied Africa. My roots are African. And my boss, Kenton, as I mentioned, had wanted me to go to the Near East, NEA, Near East and South Asia, that region in the Foreign Service. He said, he felt I had the ability. And he said, if you get Arabic under you and you have Portuguese, you get some Arabic, you get some French, you're set in the Foreign Service. He was looking at it for me career-wise and in terms of advancement. My husband, on the other hand, said, I don't think I want to go work in the Middle East. I did African studies. I really want to stay in it. I would like to work in Africa. He had worked in Africa already and he wanted to return. Well, we were newlyweds and I didn't really want to go off without him. So my first post in Africa, I chose strategically because a lot of the Black Brazilians who came from Africa came from Dahomey, which is now Benin. And it turned out that Cotonou needed a public affairs officer, a PAO. And I left huge, huge Brasilia to go to tiny, tiny Cotonou. In terms of culture, in terms of the history, it was very interesting to move from Brazil. I first came to Washington, studied French for 6 months, and then went on to Cotonou. But I'll tell you, even though the Brazilians came from there was very little that the two posts professionally had in common. Cotonou was tiny. Brazil was huge. Brazil had extraordinary support staff, Foreign Service nationals, we call them, and these days we call them locally engaged staff. Francophone Africa, the smaller countries in particular, really suffered in finding qualified people to work at the US mission. This is not true today, but in those times, in the 70s and 80s, it was very true. And so I had, for example, a librarian whose English was very poor, who had joined the American Cultural Center, which is where I worked, and I was the director of the American Cultural Center, otherwise the public affairs officer. And he had come in as a guard. Nothing wrong with it if you're in upward mobility, but he didn't have the skills. But we were there was the selection, the possibilities of staff were so limited. And I did a short assignment in Cotonou last year, and it was just so incredible, the difference. The people who work with us now are just so highly qualified and so wonderful. But nevertheless, it was a challenge for me when I went in there in 1985, January. And I spent 2.5 years really working on improving staff quality. That was my challenge. That was my objective, was to do it better. And I feel like I left Cotonou by July 8, 1987 with better staff for the person who succeeded me. But what was wonderful about Cotonou is because it was a small country, it was easier for an officer, for me, to get connected with local people. So I made lots of friends. Um, Not that I hadn't in Brazil, uh, but other than the local staff in Brazil, the woman who was my assistant there, Angelina, I'm still in touch with today. But in Cotonou, there were people in the local community who became very good friends. Because after all, our message from the American Cultural Center was to tell that story about America with local people. And I enjoyed that experience very much. When I went back last year, I still had friends that I could look up from the time there in 1985 to 87. Um, Programs that we emphasized were the exchanges, the professional exchanges, the Fulbright program. But in those days, we actually had a little bit of money in the government, in U.S. Information Agency, USIA, and we could invite talented um, performers and artists. And so we would have at least once a year, perhaps twice, um, an American performer, a jazz singer, or small orchestra come out and perform for the local audiences, and they loved it. There was always the first opportunity was something that the ambassador hosted and would have his senior officials and senior members in the private sector come and be entertained by an American performer. And then we could open it out to the wider public, to the students at the university. If there was, in Codenou's case, there was a stadium and people could come out there. And the musicians would also offer workshops with local musicians, which was always great fun. And they enjoyed that. Um, and that sort of is the basis of the kinds of activities that we we did. On the political front, because Benin at the time was a Marxist Leninist country, um, working with the ambassador, our major objective was to try to move the political decision makers away from this Marxist Leninist to a more democratic style of government, to free and open elections, to allowing civil society activists to participate in governing of the people and so on. And I enjoyed that, and I learned a lot. In 1987, we moved to Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire. I loved Abidjan. I loved Abidjan. It was really the Paris of West Africa. Um, I focused in Abidjan on higher education. I was the cultural affairs officer this time, the CAO, rather than the PAO who did a little bit of everything. In the very small countries in Africa, you have just, in those days, you had just one American officer, and that was the public affairs officer. And Cote d'Ivoire was considered a medium-sized country. So you had a public affairs officer, a cultural affairs officer, and an information officer. So those three, and the public affairs officer oversaw all of us, as well as the managing of the American Cultural Centers, which is where we worked in those days. My work in a higher education allowed room for creativity. We had a robust Fulbright program for a small country. It wasn't like Brazil, where we probably had like 40 Fulbrighters, but we probably had 3 or 4 Fulbrighters in Cote d'Ivoire from America who came out. And their presence alone gave us many opportunities to interact with our academic counterparts at the National University. One of the things that the Minister of Higher Education wanted was to have more Ivorian students um, study in the United States, get their master's and higher degrees in the US, and particularly in the fields of science and what we would call STEM today. Um, and I was very pleased because um, Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal were kind of the heart of the Francophonie in Africa, and they all looked to France. So the fact that here, this minister, who ended up actually being the chairperson for the Francophonie in French West Africa, um, wanted the United States to work with his best students and place them at US institutions was a challenge for me, but I got um, to persuade the Fulbright office in Washington to agree to put them under the Fulbright umbrella. The government of Cote d'Ivoire was going to pay for their room and board, and it was just up to Fulbright to try to find universities that would give them tuition waivers or tuition assistance. And it worked out very well. It was such a successful program that I was surprised at the end of my tour um, with an award from the government of Cote d'Ivoire. It was what they call Chevalier de l'Ordre National, um, a knight of the National Order, and it was for education. I was so pleased. It was a big surprise. I didn't realize that they'd be paying that much attention, and that. But I was excited about this program. Um, but a lot of times it depends. Your enthusiasm isn't necessarily the enthusiasm that others who come after you will have. But certainly for those few years that that program ran, I think it made a big difference in educating young Ivorians in science and technology in the United States. I was pleased about that.
That's
Um,
wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, After that, I had been overseas now 9 years almost. And Washington said, "Oh, you think we've forgotten about you? No, we haven't. It's time to come home. Come back and see what it means to be an American, get readjusted, find out what's going on in the headquarters before you go out again." And my career counselor, these are the people who put you into positions. And I mentioned my first one had been Kathy, who helped me get a good job in Brazil. Well, my career counselor in Washington at this time, I forget his name, but he was very good. Up to that point, I have to tell you, there were very few people who had been difficult. I didn't mention that the first ambassador I had in Cotonou um, was a bit of a challenge because there was so much else good that sort of countered it. And I have to say that generally speaking, in my first 9 years, I had a wonderful experience in the Foreign Service. I came back to Washington. I was a career counselor for the new employees, for the new Foreign Service officers. They called them junior officer trainees, as I had been myself when I went into Brazil. I did that job for 2 years. It was wonderful. Um, I felt like it was an opportunity to merge my love of being an educator and academic and being a diplomat because it was an opportunity to teach new officers coming in what the Foreign Service was all about. And I worked closely with my colleague who was the training officer. Um, and and in this case, turned out that the training officer was one of my classmates, Dan Shrevney. We had come into the Foreign Service together. So the second year that I was a career counselor, Dan was the um, training officer, and he and I worked well in placing the officers after they had been trained and trained or gone through orientation into the Foreign Service, and then um, I helped place them. They had a choice. say maybe they would list 5 countries. Maybe there was a list of 20 countries that were available, and then they would give their priority of first 5 that they would like. And we always tried to help them get somewhere in their first 1, 2, 3 choices. And then it was the exciting time to have a big party and say, who's going where? That was always lovely. Um, I very much enjoyed my work in Washington, and our 3 years here were great for my family, for my children to get acculturated to America. Um, I actually came back home with my mother. My father had just died, and so she came and stayed with us in the DMV, and that was a nice addition to our family as well. Um, then it was time to go back overseas. And in 1994, no, yes, 1994, I was assigned to Baban in what was then Swaziland and is now Eswatini. I'd heard so much about this lovely little kingdom in Southern Africa, described as the Switzerland of Southern Africa. Beautiful country, mountainous, and Baban was very quiet. There was a king, and America and monarchies don't do well, except for Great Britain. Um, so um, we, of course, and we probably continue to make these futile attempts to get the king to change and consider being a constitutional monarch, which he won't be. But I enjoyed my time in Swaziland. People of Southern Africa are very different from the people in West Africa. They're very much more low key, very much sort of quieter in tone. Um, but historically, it was good for me to learn about Southern Africa. Um, the um, the Swazi people are cousins of the Zulus. So I had studied a little bit about it at Howard, about Southern Africa in my studies, but being there firsthand was incredible. And it was also a historically fascinating time in the region, um, because 1994 was, of course, the birth of the free South Africa, and President Mandela was freed and became the first Black president. Um, I served in Baban. I had a lovely staff. I remember visiting Baban from Mozambique, where my husband had been, and I had taken a little leave without pay to be with him in his first Foreign Service post with USAID. So he was in Maputo. If I said Baban, I am mistaken. He was in Maputo in Mozambique, and I spent a little while with him before I moved to Swaziland. And so I physically already had a little introduction to Southern Africa. Um, Lovely people, beautiful climate, and my work as director of the American Cultural Center was a learning experience, a new experience. I remember visiting them from Maputo, and every morning at 10 o'clock, they had tea. And Beauty, this wonderful lady, would go around with her trolley and tea for all the staff. And then she came around again in the afternoon at 3. And I thought, this is so different from Washington. This is so different from any other post I've served in Latin America or in Africa. I said, I think I'm going to like it here. It was a different pace of life. It wasn't so rushed as Brazil had been, or even Ivory Coast was a little sort of faster pace. This was a different pace, and yet I'll tell you, we got a lot of work done. In Swaziland, I did a lot of work with women's programs, training women in business. We did a lot of work with coordinating HIV/AIDS programs, which was as you will remember, the dreadful disease that sort of hit the whole Southern Africa region, but particularly South Africa, Swaziland, and um, Maputo, Mozambique. Um, I enjoyed my time there. the public affairs officer in South Africa had visited me in Swaziland, and he asked me then, would I come, would I consider coming to South Africa to be the country cultural affairs officer? There were in South Africa four constituent, well, three other constituent posts apart from Pretoria, the capital, and two of them, Johannesburg and Cape Town, had cultural affairs officers, and Durban had just the one public affairs officer. And he asked me, would I come to Pretoria to be the cultural affairs officer overseeing all of the cultural and educational programs in the country? What a magnificent thought. 1996. Nelson Mandela was the president. History. And I thought, Amelia, how did you get into this? What a fantastic career. And I'm very pleased that I got to South Africa because the people were wonderful. I learned a great deal about the country. I enjoyed their food, the traditional food, the Boer food. And I got feeling integrated into the society quite quickly. I was in Pretoria for 2.5 years, and I left before my tour ended because my husband got sent to Conakry, Guinea, and I had to end my tour in Pretoria a little early and went up to Conakry. And I will never forget at the farewell party that my wonderful boss, Tom Hull, had for me, the ambassador James Joseph said at the time, I can understand someone leaving Conakry to come to Pretoria, but I can't quite understand someone rushing out of Pretoria to go to Conakry, Guinea. And I said to him, well, sir, it's called love. And he had a good laugh. And so I left Pretoria, having had wonderful experiences learning about the culture of South Africa, the people of South Africa, doing great programs with the Dance Theater of Harlem, the Alvin Ailey group coming in. We did a lot. Getting involved with the Fulbright Commission. There was the Gore Mbeki Commission that was Vice President Gore and Deputy President Mbeki, who wanted to do something special for to strengthen the relationship between the United States and South Africa. And I was with an AID colleague, head of the Higher Education Commission. So we did a lot to promote the Fulbright program, and that was very satisfying. I moved on to Conakry, Guinea. And if anybody wonders, why would you move from a great and mighty country like South Africa to Conakry, Guinea? Well, I'll tell you. What was happening in the West Africa subregion at that time was the war in Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone, I have a special affinity to because it is the birthplace of my father. And I spent my many childhood years there. So I was concerned, and it was sort of, again, a godsend, putting me in Conakry as the public affairs officer, the director of the American Cultural Center. I collaborated in a lot of women in development activities with the USAID, with the United Nations, with the French Embassy, with the Guinean authorities. I supported the media coverage of peace talks at the end of that sub-regional war, really, because it was Liberia, Sierra Leone, and then Guinea was kind of the moderator for it all. Secretary of State Albright visited Conakry when I was there. Lots of international media came. I remember Charlene Hunter Galt was up there. I had gotten to know her quite well and her husband in South Africa because of the Fulbright Commission. Jesse Jackson came up and participated in the peace discussions. There was a war crimes ambassador who I worked closely with. Um, so being in Conakry at that time, from 1998 to 2000, was an important historic time. And I gained a lot of experience. I had a good staff. We did a lot of good programs, Black History Month, Women's History Month, uh, and and I think the Guineans appreciated the American Cultural Center and its work. In 2000, I got my dream assignment. I had always wanted to work in Durban. Ever since I knew Southern Africa, which was from 1994 when I was in Swaziland, I had found out about Durban. I had visited Durban. I had put my daughter in boarding school in Durban. And I thought, this is the city. This is my dream city. Other than Brasilia, this is where I want to end my career. And I got it. Um, it wasn't in the scheme of things in terms of career and grade levels and all of that, but I just loved the city. I liked the people. I liked the work that we did there. Um, and so in 2000, I got my dream to serve in Durban. And we did many wonderful programs there with the provincial government, a lot of HIV/AIDS work, a lot of work in technology, a lot of work in higher education with Fulbright. We had a lot of congressional um, visitors. We actually had a big UN conference, a conference on racism in Durban before I retired. And I remember having I was actually again assigned to be the control officer for Reverend Jesse Jackson. And um, and so it was exciting and fulfilling in many ways.
May I
And
ask you, excuse me for
sure,
interrupting, may I ask you to just talk a little bit about what a control officer does?
oh, of course. As a control officer, I had to organize the program for the principal, for the visitor. Um, you were given by Washington what the time frame was, what the person wanted to achieve during that time. You organized that with the help of colleagues. And if I needed to make appointments for that person with local authorities, with host country government, political um, um, officials, or people in the NGO community, or people in his case in the religious community as well, and in the diaconia of churches in Durban. I did for him that. He wanted to go around and talk to people about HIV and getting the HIV and getting tested for HIV. I think he himself did the HIV test to show them, see, it's not that hard. And we did that at a university campus and to get other young people to do that because it was a dreadful disease at the time, ravaging South Africa, ravaging Southern Africa, in fact. Um, and when the person arrives, of course, you are their companion. So you meet them at the airport, take them to their hotel, um, and accompany them to all the appointments. And if they want any downtime to do personal shopping, um, see cultural sites, you accompany them there. So you're in charge of that person for the entirety of their visit. And in the case of Reverend Jackson, this time, because it was a conference on racism, I chose to host a party in his honor and to meet. And so I got all the Congressional Black Caucus delegation. It actually was a time when we didn't show up very well, America. We were not on the right side of history there. We did not support the racism resolution. We were against the UN racism resolution, um, but the the African American representatives who were there and who were for the resolution, I had them over to meet South African dignitaries, and so even though as a diplomat and I am there representing my country and what the government says, I also can balance, and as an African American woman, I can share with the public that America is a democracy. This is a government stance, but here are these elected, and it was great for me to use here are these elected officials in the US government who do not agree with their government, get to meet them and talk to them. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me to balance the act. And Jesse Jackson came with quite an entourage. I remember Charles Ogletree, late Charles Ogletree, lawyer, was part of his group. And he spent a lot of time in my library. I'm looking at my books right now as I speak to you, and I remember him going through and telling me, wow, you got a first edition there. And I'm going, I never knew that. But they were great. And before I proceed and tell you about the end of my career and what came next, I forgot something rather important in Conakry, Guinea. And Guinea was really a significant posting for me. And one of the reasons is Jesse Jackson came, as I said, part of the peace talks for that Charles Taylor and Sierra Leone war, was Stokely Carmichael had lived in Guinea all these many years since he left the United States and had married Miriam Makeba, and their relationship fell apart, but he stayed on in Guinea. And Reverend Jackson wanted to meet him. He knew he was there. So my husband's colleagues at USAID helped me make this appointment. Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, was in the hospital. He was dying. He was in the hospital at that time. So this was at the end of his life. And Reverend Jackson arrived in Conakry. And since I was the control officer, I met him. And I had told him already that Kwame Ture wanted to meet him, or that I had arranged the meeting that he wanted, rather, Jackson wanted with Kwame Ture. And so I made that happen. It was on a Friday. And it went so well. I did the introductions. Kwame Ture is such a gentleman. I remember him taking my hand and kissing my hand and saying, what a pleasure to meet such a lovely woman and all of this. What a chevalier he was. And so I left him with Reverend Jackson. They had a wonderful hour-long talk. Jackson came out of it. Really, you could see he was just emotionally torn, but happy that he had satisfied that he had seen his brother, even though they were on, as you know, the history of the civil rights movement. Stokely was with the SCLC, and Reverend Jackson was with Reverend Martin Luther King on the other side. And no, I'm getting
SNCC.
He was with Stokely was with
Student
SNCC,
Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then the Black Power movement.
Yes, and Jackson was with SCLC, the
Right.
Reverend Martin Luther King's organization. But it was like two brothers coming together. And so when he came out, he said, "You think I can see him again?" But his schedule was very tight. And I said, "Well, we'll see what we can do." So we arranged it for the Sunday following. And you know, Atim, they met that Sunday. And Kwame Ture was just so happy. They embraced. It was wonderful. It was brief. And within 24 hours, he was gone. And I thought, you know, if I ever write memoirs, I have to remember these key points. I have to just, for every place, I have to think of a key point. Because I often say, why did God put me here? This is why God put you here. And certainly for Conakry, Guinea, which otherwise to a lot of people seems insignificant, in the scheme of things, when you look at Brazil and you look at South Africa, why Conakry? Well, that was why. I felt like that was why. And then for Durban, why was I there? If nothing else, for that racism conference and for all the work that we did for HIV/AIDS. And it really was very successful programming that we did. If in training journalists on how to cover the subject with compassion, training the people who worked in the NGOs of how to get the word out and so on. This was the end of my career. In 2002, I loved it. I had given it my all. Generally, I worked from about 8:30 in the morning to a minimum of 8:30 at night every day for 5 days in the week. Oftentimes, I didn't leave until 10 or 11 or 12 or 1 a.m. And obviously, I had worn myself thin. And I'm sad that I left because there was so much more that I wanted to do. But I'm glad that I left because I'm alive to talk to you today. I'm also glad that I left because it gave me an opportunity to close that door, which was in a very important door in my life, but to open another very interesting door, which was the job of being a rehired annuitant. When I left the Foreign Service in 2002, it was a service very poorly um, equipped in terms of, and it still is, unfortunately, in terms of personnel. They had not enough officers for all the positions that they had in the world, or if they had enough for certain periods, they didn't have for the gaps. And so when I retired in 2002, I took a little rest, but not for long. And then I became a rehired annuitant, an REA, and a kind of consultant in the Foreign Service. And for the last 22 years, that's what I've done. Being a gap filler, I have helped um, what is now public diplomacy because in 1999, U.S. Information Agency merged with the Department of State and became the public diplomacy specialty, the cone, the public diplomacy arm of the Foreign Service. And so I have worked in that field for 20 years, 22 years, in 20 African countries, in offices in Washington, at the Foreign Service Institute, our Foreign Service University, all in some area of public diplomacy. And I've loved it. Mostly I work for like 2 to 4 months at a time, filling in the gap when post overseas a mission, a U.S. embassy needs it, or as I said, a Washington office needs specialty. Like I did some strategic planning to plan for what we now call the public diplomacy implementation plan. I helped with the creation of that process. I did teaching of public diplomacy as a specialty to new entrants who came in to the Foreign Service Institute. Um, so in sort of globally, that's what I have done for the last 44 years of my life.
Wow. But let me ask you this. Let's think about the future and those who might be watching this interview. And let me ask you to speak to the future. What would you say to that person who's looking at this recording now about diplomacy and the career and that type of service?
Well, as much as I very much wanted to be a teacher, an undergraduate professor, I am so grateful that God led me to diplomacy. I don't think I would have gotten the same satisfaction as I have had this 40 years from anything else. And I'm passionate about public diplomacy because public diplomacy is a, a merging of education, information, and diplomacy. And for me, it is a way of sharing what is good about America and explaining what is not so good and what we need to do to make it better. So, looking toward my future, I hope I will have some time to write about it. I'd like to be able to spend time to share my experiences. I've done a little bit, and you know about our project. A group of 11 of us African American women who worked in public diplomacy have written about various aspects of our experiences overseas or in Washington because we have two civil service colleagues who joined us. And we've written it. We have a great literary agent. We're now looking for a publisher to be able to share this story with a wider America, with young people interested in foreign affairs, particularly young Black women, but not only them, any young people of color, could be Hispanic young people, could be Asian young people, wanting them to know what are the positives and what are the challenges and how do you cope when you come into a career as exciting as diplomacy is. And representing the United States overseas is a gift. It's a very satisfying experience. It has its challenges because we're not a perfect country. And people often say, how can you, a Black woman, come across and tell me about your country that doesn't like you or doesn't treat people who look like you well? I said, well, we have to look at the long history. I have to look at the history from when my father was refused service in Hagerstown, Maryland, to now, and to see the progress where his daughter was able to enter the Foreign Service in the United States and welcomed and share that story of America with people in South America and people in Africa. And I also worked with, what do we call them? Contractors who work with the government. This is a woman-owned company with AID, and they asked me to serve as a consultant and teach English to AID staff in Asia, South America, and Central America and Africa. So that was a good experience. If that kind of opportunity comes up again, I'd love that in terms of the future. I enjoyed that very much because, again, they were short term. They were programs of 2 and 3 weeks. So I don't have to leave my beautiful grandchildren for too long, which is another consideration that I have now. I have 2 wonderful grandchildren, and this is 2024, and they are 10 and 8, and I enjoy their company very much. We live in an intergenerational home, and I'm happy to be with them. So that's looking towards my future, is to write. And if short-term opportunities come up, I would be happy to take those and to share of the knowledge that I have gained over these 44 years.
Thank you so very much for taking the time. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Ateem.